From the Emmy-nominated Erie Veterans Series, Part 3 of Common Bonds, POW MIA. The true stories of the men and women in our community who endure the effects and emotions of war. Common Bonds, POW MIA, proudly brought to you by John V. Schultz, saving you more. And now, Part 3 of Common Bonds, POW MIA.
To those who have served, and those who have served in the uniformed services of the United States, we are ever mindful that the sweetness of enduring peace has always been tainted by the bitterness of personal sacrifice. We are compelled to never forget
that while we enjoy our daily pleasures, there are others who have endured and may still be enduring the agonies of pain, deprivation, and imprisonment.
We didn't get our prisoners back, and it bothers me. When I talk about things like this, it'll bother me the rest of the evening. It impacts me. It'll impact me to the day I die. Those are my brothers. And it's probably the most tragic thing in the Vietnam War. I'm a co-chairman of the Purple Heart Memorial, and every year we have a gathering of Gold Star mothers there because we have a bench that says honoring Gold Star mothers. On Gold Star Mother Days, we get the Gold Star mothers there that want to attend, present them with roses, and we give them a hug, and we cherish them. And they said, we know what happened to our sons, but we could not imagine having a missing in action son because they have no closure. They said that is the saddest part of the war, and I'd have to agree with them, although I'm very sympathetic to Gold Star mothers. We honor them and we cherish them, but to have no closure. I was a heavy equipment operator in the Seabees. Seabees' sole purpose is to provide construction support for the Marine Corps. So we were up north with the Marines, and what a fine bunch of guys. So second deployment, I was up around Red Beach, Da Nang area, working up in the Hai Von Pass. And then the third deployment, I extended over for an early out in the third deployment. I went to the dispatch shack where the equipment operators operate out of, and the chief said, the war's winding down. If you stay here on camp, you've got to be spit-shined and starched. I said, in Vietnam? He said, yeah, things are changing. And he said, however, there is a detachment that you can work in cutoffs and T-shirts. There's a lot of casualties out there, so you have to volunteer to go out there. So I said, that's where I want to go, cutoffs and T-shirts. So I was there 2 weeks before I ran over a landmine and got wounded. I was driving an earth mover. It was a scraper or a pan. It was a four-wheel drive tractor. I was heavily loaded. I had probably about 70,000 pounds of dirt in the back. So I was back heavy. So when my front tire went off the mine, or went over the mine, it didn't detonate until it was behind my rear tire, and that's what saved me. If I wasn't so heavily loaded, it might have went off under my front tire, would have came up in my face. So I was real lucky. Someone was looking after me. And they sent me back into base, and my ears were blown out. I couldn't hear anything. They said, you can stay here at the base now because you can if you want because you've been wounded. And I said, I don't know anybody here on base. Send me back with my guys. There was camaraderie there. And went back, and I couldn't hear for probably 3-4 days. Chief was looking at me and saying stuff, and it's all I could see was his lips move. But we lost a few guys on our detachment. We had on our detachment, we had a lot of mines, and there was a few firefights. Our detachment was a platoon and a half of men, which would be about 65 to 70 guys. And by our corpsman, hospital corpsman's count, we had 46 casualties. I knew we had a lot of casualties, but I didn't think it was over 50%. But they would put plastic C4 in wooden boxes with dowel pins, and the Marine detachment that we had to provide would help us with security at night and to sweep the roads every morning. The government gave them metal minesweepers. They go over the road and say, okay, boys, come on down. It's safe. And boom, every morning we would draw straws. The guy who got the short straw would be the first one down the road. Well, July 23rd, I think it was, I got the short straw. But glad I'm alive. Lucky I'm alive. When I march in parades in my black uniform, basically I do it in remembrance of them. I've been involved in the issue since mid-80s. And when we had the moving walls into town a few times, twice actually, I was assigned the honor of escorting the POW MIA parents to and from the wall, and I got to meet them, to talk to them, and they said it was just awful what the government was giving them. Mixed stories. They would try to get information. The government was resistive. There's just so many sad things associated with the issue. It's just a travesty of justice. The one difference we did make, well, I should say that the reason why we were able to try to do so much during Vietnam or after Vietnam was World War II, there were 20,000 POWs kept. And people were so glad to come home and get on with their lives and to have a house with a white picket fence and a family. And there wasn't the media back then that there was after Vietnam. And because of the media, I think was one of the reasons why we were able to garner information, so on and so forth. But the one difference that we did make as Vietnam vets, we couldn't get ours home. Oh, need to elaborate on that. We didn't get ours home, but now when there's a prisoner of war, they take action immediately. The POW-MI families I had contact with was 15, 20 years ago. The parents, most parents are gone, as mine. The POWs I'm aware of now are World War II vets that come to the ceremony at the VA hospital each year. And of course, we treat them with utmost reverence as well. The ones held in the Pacific were much more brutalized than the ones held in Germany. The Japanese were horrific atrocities. A lot of veterans with bad combat experiences come home and shut down. Every year at the VA, there's a ceremony honoring POW-MIAs on the third Friday of September, which is POW-MIA Recognition Day. We have about a half a dozen people that come for that ceremony, and I'm sure there's people that shut down and don't want to do with that, and understandably so. PTSD is expected and common amongst POWs, and if you don't want to deal with a horrific event, you just shut it out. Or do you? You shut it out publicly, but I don't think you can forget it in your head. It's there to deal with the rest of your life. That humans do unimaginable things to other humans in times of war.
The small table, which occupies a place of dignity and honor, is set for one, symbolizing the fact that members of our armed forces are missing from our ranks. They are referred to as POWs or MIAs. We call them comrades. They are unable to be here with their loved ones and families, so we join together, pay humble tribute to them, and bear witness to their continued absence. The table is small, symbolizing the frailty of one prisoner, alone against his or her oppressors.
I spent extensive training through the States, and then I was assigned to a squadron in California. We was flying night fights and such, and this particular day we was flying a two-man plane mission up into Tokyo Bay. And we just got up there and got tangled up with some fighters, and lost the plane that I was in, and the other plane managed to get back to base in pieces. There was 12 of us and 4 of them didn't make it. That's the hardest part. I mean, these are great young men that we grew up together and shared things together, and even in training we used to have a good time together. So the 8 of us that made it out were very fortunate. From then I was picked up at sea by the Japanese patrol boat. They waited till dusk. This was around noon when this happened, and they waited until after dusk to pick us up. And when they picked us up, they started to get brutal right away. And I had brand new clothes on. I had a brand new pair of Marine combat shoes, new socks, and they cut everything off of me, and I went barefoot the rest of the time. And from there we were taken into a dungeon, which was apparently was an empty warehouse. And they kept us in there overnight and kept watch on us every hour. And then in the morning they took us up in a courtyard and jerked us around like they was going to behead us. And so we left there probably about noon, and they took us and marched us around the square and put us in a train and shipped us up north. The camp was Ofuna. It was 29 miles south of Tokyo, and it was Tokyo's main offspring camp. It was a concentration camp where they took you in there and treated you and beat you, and after they got all the information out of you they wanted, then they sent you to Tokyo. But we never got out of there. We stayed there all the time we were there. And so we were there when the war ended, and we seen changes in the guards, and we knew something was up, but we didn't know what. But we were in the camp a day and a half by ourselves. How long I was a prisoner is a question, and it's a question I don't like to answer, because to me it was forever. But it was a short time. It was more like 30 days. But they made up for it in 30 days. We were beaten constantly. I can remember one morning that we were confined to a little room, about 4 by 6, and it had a rice mat to sleep on, with one thin mosquito net. And the guard come in one morning, and I was in a daze. I didn't know where I was. I didn't know what I was doing. And I can remember sitting there, and he's hollering at me, and of course I don't know what he's saying. So as he's hollering at me and hitting me with his bamboo, he says something about no stand up, sit down. So I thought he said, don't stand up, sit down. So when I stood up, he hit me, and when I sit down, he hit me. And he finally threw it at me and left. And they would check every 4 hours. And during the night, there'd be a lot of rumpus going on in the camp, and we found out later that's when they was fighting amongst themselves. They even beat each other up if you're out of line. I think it's more, like you say, it's more anger at yourself than anything. Like I say, people ask me about this particular situation, and I said it's like a crease in your head that never goes away. It's like a crease in your brain, and it's sometimes very hard to talk about. Being in any danger of losing my life, I didn't, because they were bad, and I didn't ever think of reacting when I got beat. I just rolled it right off. I had to have some superpower somewhere that give me the instinct to just do what you got to do.
The tablecloth is white, symbolizing the purity of their intentions to respond to our country's call to arms.
Common Bonds, POW MIA, will return in a moment. We now return to Common Bonds, POW MIA.
The Bible represents faith in a higher power and pledge to our country, founded as one nation under God.
I thought, well, you know, I'm almost 65 years old. I've never even seen a picture of my dad. There's no cemetery to visit. There was never a funeral, no headstone. It's like he disappeared off the face of the earth. I was given up for adoption when I was only 10 days old. And all I was ever told was that if I asked about him, it's just that he didn't come back. These years, it's still tough to talk about. Yeah, and then I started to find out things. I waited till my adopted parents had passed on, and I started trying to find out things. And I was about to turn 65, and I talked to a friend of mine that does a lot of things on the computer. Could you find out, you know, where my dad might be buried? And I'd like to go there and just visit his gravesite. Never been there. So he started to research, and he came back and he said he's not buried anywhere. He said his plane went down in the Pacific, and I'm almost 65, and I'm hearing this for the first time. And I heard how he was a tail gunner on a B-29, and they were bombing the Mitsubishi aircraft plant in Nakashima. And there were 108 B-29s on that bombing mission. And one of the planes, it was named Pappy's Pullman, got shot down over land, and they captured 9 of the 11 crew members. My dad's plane was Maximum Effort 3, and they had dropped their bombs on the plant, and they were heading back to Northfield, Guam, and they ran into a swarm of Japanese Zeros. But the pilot that was in the lead plane said he had actually been in what they call the slot, and going into the run, the lead plane developed an engine problem and had to drop away and fly back to Guam. So he moved from the slot to the lead. But he said this Zero was coming straight at him, guns blazing, and he said he thought he was going to be rammed. And at the last second, the Zero dove under, but it pulled up abruptly and took the right wing off my dad's plane. And the witnesses that were there said they thought 7 parachutes came out of that plane, but the other Zeros that were right there used these guys for target practice. And they said you could see them being hit under their chutes. Unfortunately, instead of being declared killed in action, they were designated missing in action. So it gave his parents and my mother, it gave them hope that somehow maybe he might have survived and been captured, and they would not give up hope that somehow he would return. Of course, he never did. And within 5 years, both of his parents and my mother passed away. I think it just broke their hearts trying to hold out hope that somehow he would have survived that. It's a cruel thing, but of course none of the 11 ever came back from that. I wear this every day. It's just a commemorative dog tag. It just says Sergeant Don Huff, U.S. Army Air Force, 6/22/45, B-29 tail gunner, never forgotten. Just a tribute, and he's never forgotten. Think about him numerous times every single day. I can't tell you any great war stories. I was in the Air Force, and you know, if people want to hear combat stories, they need to talk to the Marines or the Army or the Navy SEALs or somebody like that. But I think it was more like maybe ducking an occasional rocket or something like that. My thought was, okay, I'm going to risk my life. What could I possibly deliver to these people? And my thought was, well, we need to give them their independence and personal freedom. Yeah, but they, unfortunately, Ho Chi Minh wanted to give that to his countrymen under communism. And for that, it cost us 58,000 lives. I give a speech over in Connie at D-Day on occasion. And I end that talk by telling them 1,742 missing in action from Vietnam. Korea, we had 8,050. In World War II, we had 74,791. And I end by saying, now you've heard the story of one of these. But it's kind of thought-provoking. So maybe we're getting better. You know, 74,000 from World War II, that's an awful lot to be accounted for. And many thousands don't have the history that my father had. You know, they're just gone off the face of the earth. A lot of broken hearts.
The red ribbon on the vase represents the red ribbon worn on the lapels of the thousands who demand, with an unyielding determination, a proper account of our comrades who are not among us.
I didn't know what to expect. I had known Greg since we were 13 years old. We had gone together all through school, and my parents sent me away to college so that I wouldn't get married right out of high school, but it didn't work. I went down south, and then when I came home, we got married and spent the rest of our honeymoon at Fort Bragg, North Carolina. And we were there for 2 weeks, and then he shipped out. He would write to me every day, and I would write to him every day. He would end up getting maybe 12, 15 letters at one time because of where he was located at the time, and same with me. And he would write in detail. How they let those letters go through, I don't know. But on the one mountain that he was on in the Cambodian border, it was honeycombed with Viet Cong. And I hadn't heard from him in almost a month, and I went to the Red Cross. A lady by the name of Judy Dingfelder, and I'll never forget it. And I told her, there's something wrong. There's something definitely wrong. And I kept seeing things on TV, and all I could think of was the Viet Cong overran them, and something's wrong. She came back to me and said, Janie, they're having trouble there, and the weather isn't cooperating. They can't get the helicopters up there to take anything up or bring anything back. But we found out that he's okay. And that was a really rude awakening for me. but he was a radio operator, and so they were getting few and far between. So when they would need someone, he would go from one unit to another. He was on relay for the fellas, so wherever he was needed, he went from unit to unit. When he came home in '69, and then in the '70s, they started talking about POWs. And then later, like in about '71 or '72, a friend of ours asked him about the POWs. And Greg said, I don't know if there's many left. They didn't take a whole lot of POWs. And God bless those poor bastards that were taken. I hope they come home. The ones that they didn't take were probably the lucky ones. And that's all he would say about it. He never brought that up again, ever. Most of the veterans that came home from Vietnam, I noticed, as my husband did, he lost himself in work and his family. He was a dedicated family man, a dedicated worker. And when he retired, his mind started to turn, and we had to find answers. Well, I know when our sons would ask him things, he honestly could not remember. I saved every letter that he wrote me. And in the last 15 years, I drug those letters out of the attic and I made him read them. And it hasn't been but the last 15 years that he had started to remember what's going on. So, a veteran's wife, even though I'm not a veteran, but I am the daughter of a veteran, the granddaughter of a veteran, sister of a veteran, a sister-in-law of a veteran, an aunt, a neighbor. I was a teacher of some veterans. And I'm blessed. He came home. He was a prisoner in his own mind, as a lot of veterans are. And all I can say is, whether it's no matter what war you're in or conflict or whatever, you have to remember. You have to remember something. And it takes a partner to help them remember. Can't lock it up in your mind. Be happy in the day you're in. They always worry about tomorrow. All I can say is, don't hide it under the carpet anymore. You know, face it. Help that vet. I don't care if it's your husband or your father or your son or your neighbor, whatever it is. If you can help them, talk about it. Some don't want to talk about it, but there's a lot of questions that need to be answered, and there's a lot of questions that they need to answer, whether they want to or not. My husband passed away 3.5 years ago. And I always told him, when we started working on this opening up business, I just wanted him happy in the day he was in. And he was. So no regrets. Did it make you grow up fast? Oh boy, it sure did. to see pictures of these 18, 19-year-olds. To sit in the cafeteria at high school and see these 4 guys come in and say, "We just enlisted in the Marines." Well, you haven't even graduated yet. I couldn't understand that. And I don't know. I remember Jack Niedrich, and he's on the Vietnam Wall. He sat in front of me in POD class, and I remember him turning around to me and he said, "Hey, Janie, do you think Greg's going to go in the service when he graduates?" And my answer, I said, "Before." I was so naive. I had no idea why would he go in the service? Jack never came home. He was one of the first fellas from McDowell to not come home.
The single red rose represents the blood they may have shed in sacrifice to ensure the freedom of our beloved United States of America. The rose also reminds us of the families and friends of our missing comrades who keep faith while awaiting their return.
When I got over there, I flew 13 missions. My pilot and some of the other guys were lucky if they had 2. On this particular mission, we were bombing the marshalling yards in Vienna, Austria. Over the bomb run, we ran into some flak, some aircraft fire, and we lost 1 engine. Well, that B-24 doesn't float very well. It doesn't glide. I mean, it's like a lead balloon. So on the way back, we were kind of losing altitude, which you expect. And of course, the pilot said, you know, we're going to try to make it back if we can, at least to a safe area. We got 2,400 gallons of gas. Me being a navigator, sat there and we tried to figure out how much fuel we consumed to that point and see how far we could make it. The pilot said, if you want to bail out, go ahead and bail out because we don't know what we're going to run into. We may get shot down by fighters or what have you. If you want to take the chance and go ahead and bail out, you're going to be on your own. But everybody decided to stay. And as we went along, all of a sudden we lost another engine. And so now with 2 engines gone, there's no way you could maintain altitude. So we had no choice, but we were fortunate enough, we got into a farm area where we were able to crash land it, which we did. On a V-24, number 3 engine was out, and that controlled all the hydraulics. So therefore, when we got there, we had to crank the wheels down ourselves. But in the process of the excitement, we forgot to turn the nose wheel down. But when we hit that old muddy field over there, we almost flipped it because, you know, that airplane's not too light, and it hit that soft mud. But here it is, it's in March, you know, early March, wet, mud, and whatnot. So when it hit, it kind of stood up on its nose, and then, of course, fell back down again. And we were very fortunate that nobody got seriously hurt. We got banged around in there because, you know, there were no seat belts in those things. They were pretty rough inside. After we were picked up by the Germans, they took us in an old farmhouse. It's that mind-boggling thing that they did. They would take us out one at a time, and then you'd hear a rifle shot, you know? Take you out one at a time, so you think you're the next. So we said our goodbyes, really, as we left. But it was just a joke on their part, because by the time you got out there, it was a big joke for them. It wasn't very funny to begin with. From there, on trucks, on a train, and everything else, ended up in Nuremberg. They decided to move it. The camp was going to be moved because it was getting pretty close to the end of the war. And so they moved us from Nuremberg to Moosburg. We had to walk that distance, about 87 miles. And that was, through the winter months in March, first part of March and whatnot. It was pretty cold. We had all those sheepskin coats and stuff I'm sure you've seen. Well, the Germans liked those. They wanted them. So all I had was a summer flying suit on, which is like a pair of coveralls is what it was. But we managed to survive that part. They marched us to the outskirts of Munich. And as we walked through there, why, the civilian population, they'd be throwing bricks at you. You were terror fleegers and whatnot. But also, when we were first captured and we were put up in this, actually it was an old schoolhouse, the guard that we had was a pretty obnoxious guy, and found out later he had lost his family in a bombing range. He lost 3 kids, he lost his wife. So, you can understand his reason for being the way he was. He was a little bit mean and whatnot, but I guess that was part of the war, and I guess you had to accept it. They put us up in barns, we're in a farmhouse somewhere. I guess, I don't think they asked permission, they just put us up in a barn. We stole a couple of potatoes, and really the biggest part was sugar beets. And we were able to break them and then chew on them. A little bit bitter, but there was a little bit of sugar in there, so it gave you a little bit of power to move on. And then, of course, I was in Moosburg. I wasn't in there very long. I was one of the very fortunate ones. It was at the end of the war for me. And so when I ended up in Moosburg, we were liberated by General Patton. He came in, and we were liberated on the 29th of April. We didn't leave the camp till probably the 15th of May, thereabouts. They flew us to Reims, France, in the hospital, and then from there they sent us back to the States. For those that paid the supreme sacrifice, I was lucky. I feel this way. For what I went through was nothing what these people or what these soldiers got in Japan. When you compare and you hear some of these stories that they tell, I was almost like R&R, in this situation, considering when you start comparing the different treatments they got. We weren't treated badly, but we weren't treated that good either. So when you compare the treatments, there is no comparison.
The slice of lemon on the plate reminds us of their bitter fate. The sprinkling of salt on the plate reminds us of the countless fallen tears of their families as they wait.
Common Bonds, POW MIA, will return in a moment. We now return to Common Bonds, POW MIA.
The black napkin stands for the emptiness these warriors have left in the hearts of their families and friends. The glass is inverted, since they cannot toast with us.
My name's Rock Kravitz. I'm telling a story about my father, Frank A. Kravitz, who was a tail gunner on a B-17 that was shot down November 2nd, 1944 on his 7th mission and became a POW until the end of the war. He spent his 21st birthday a week earlier in London, him and his crew, and they were on a mission on November 2nd, 1944, which was, I believe, the largest air raid of the war. They were going on a bombing run to Mercersburg, Germany, which is a big fuel facility that the Germans still had, and that was their mission for that day. And on their way back from dropping those their bombs, they got hit with the German fighters, and my dad was in the tail and didn't have a parachute on because he couldn't fit in the tail wearing all that stuff. So his crewmates knew that he was hit, and they told the pilot to keep the plane up in the air. Nobody's leaving until we get Frank out of the tail. So they maneuvered him out into the middle of the plane and put a parachute on him and opened it up in the plane and tossed him out, and best wishes, and the rest of them all followed suit. They all were captured, and they all became POWs, but they all survived the crash. Getting shot down and surviving that, his life and leg was saved by German doctors. But one of the things that really stuck out with him and with us and our family is he retired from Westinghouse, and he really got involved after that with the National POW organization. It wasn't something he talked about as we were growing up, but we all knew the story, and he kind of kept it in-house. But when he met a couple of fellas that were part of the POW group, it really got him enthused and involved to meet these guys and all be able to tell their story. And when President Reagan, the hostage situation, when they all came home and they got compensated for being gone, then the POW organization said, well, how about us? It's time for us to get some compensation. When my dad got shot down, I think he got a 10% disability, and when he went back to Westinghouse to get his job back, he told him he was getting 10%. Well, they assumed something was wrong with him and didn't want to hire him, so he told the government, just keep the 10% so I get my job back, and he thought that was wrong. So he was a real advocate of the POW organization. He became a national director of the Eastern region, and he was also a service officer for ex-POWs. So his wounds were severe, and he finally went in front of the generals down in Pittsburgh and said, I insist on telling my story and showing you my wounds, and they said it wasn't necessary. Well, my dad, stubborn that he was, said, well, I insist, and he dropped his drawers, and when they saw the wounds that he had all over him, they said, yeah, you get your 100%. But he also went on then to get that money for over 200 of his fellow POWs, which was probably as good a legacy as he could have left. My dad never considered himself a hero. He said he was doing a job. He went to the service. He wanted to be a pilot. He didn't qualify for the pilot school, so he took the next best thing. But my dad was the most patient, honest man that I ever met. And he said when he was in prison camp, he made a rosary out of a sheet, just taking little balls of string, and he made 10 little balls, and it was prayer and faith that got him through that.
The chair is empty. They are not here. The candle is reminiscent of the light of hope, which lives in our hearts to illuminate their way home, away from their captors to the open arms of a grateful nation.
And when I told my brother that my next duty assignment, I said, I'm going to Vietnam. And he looked at me, he said, "Are you crazy?" And I said, "Well, you went." So, but that was when I was on the POW MIA teams. That was my hardest tour of duty in all the years I was in the military. It was also my best tour of duty because it was something that was very important to me personally, because I had known about what happened. You know, I had followed that war all along. And for some of these families that had been missing their sons for so long, it was just heart-wrenching. It was terrible. So you felt like you were really trying anyway, to give something back to these families that they hadn't heard anything about their sons or brothers in years. So every time that we went to Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos, anytime we would find remains, you know, you always hoped that it was something that would give these families some answers, because, you know, they had been missing for so long. Well, the organization, when I first went in there, it was JCRC. And that's the time, around the time that the Vietnamese threw us out of the country. The Vietnamese did the recoveries, and they would send the remains back to, you know, to the Americans in the outfit. There was sometimes really, like in the early 80s, the Vietnamese released, I think it was 16 or 17 sets of remains sometime in the early 80s, and the Vietnamese allowed us to come back in. And we went mostly to Vietnam and to Laos. And because the Khmer Rouge were still fighting in Cambodia, we didn't go back into Cambodia until somewhere in 91 or 92. In fact, the first couple of times we had teams that went in there, there was rockets, shells, and fighting going on. We just sort of left everything where it was and just got out, you know, and waited till things calmed down. And initially, the Americans and the Vietnamese would have what they called a tech talk. And the Americans would present to the Vietnamese officials, these are the places we want to go because we know that one of our aircraft went down in this area. And we want to dig up this area to see if we can find remains. Or we have information from someone that was in a refugee camp that said that, you know, such and such aircraft came down, you know, in his village and crashed. And so we want to go there and see if, the refugee said, you know, that him and his dad buried the pilot's remains. So we'd say, well, we want to go to this area or that area, because we had to get permission from the Vietnamese to do everything. So once the Vietnamese approved it, then it took, maybe another three weeks or so to get the teams together. Well, I know the official response from our government was always that the Vietnamese are very cooperative, and the Vietnamese, they were not cooperative. To me, they were not cooperative as much as they claimed to be. But you know, we weren't allowed to bring our own helicopters. We had to use theirs. Their helicopters were like cannibalized parts from our aircraft and Russian aircraft that was left over from the war. So you'd get in the aircraft, the door handle was a rope, the plexiglass, if it was there, was cracked. There was no bolts, maybe one or two bolts on the seat to hold the seat down to the floor. You know, you'd get up maybe 5,000 feet and you'd get all this fog that would come into the aircraft on these rickety old helicopters. They wouldn't let us use our own. And then they would charge us for it. It got to be a very irritating subject, you know, for me, and I'm sure some of, you know, my fellow Americans, that we had to pay to ride in these rickety old things. Believe me, you prayed to Buddha, Jesus, God, Allah, anybody listening, or anybody that cared that you wouldn't crash. Well, there was a couple of families that actually came to the embassy in Bangkok and came to our office and would ask our commander what was going on with their case. You know, and it wasn't very often that people did that, but a few of the families, yeah, they came right to the embassy. I would say at least 6 family members during the time that I was there were satisfied with what we found and that they agreed that it was their loved one. But some families, you know, we would find such small pieces of bone or a tooth or something like that that they wanted more. So the government, our government, could not close that case until the families were satisfied with, you know, what we brought back. And, you know, some of these remains were 30 years old, 20 years old. We used to have people come to the embassy bringing last night's chicken bones, trying to tell us that they were American remains, and give me some money, I'll give you the bones. It got to you after a while how, you know, these people would just try to rip you off. It's a good example of what the JCRC, JTFFA, what they had to put up with the locals. The ones that were willing to accept, you know, the remains, most of them, yes, they were very grateful. I mean, they'd have been looking for their son or their brother for years, and they just want one little piece of him to bring him home. Like after the Second World War, of course, we had missing Americans from that war too, but the issue wasn't really pushed as much. But those wives that had lost their husbands, they're the ones that really pushed and pushed and pushed until our government finally did something about all these guys that were missing from Vietnam. Families, I think they probably went more to our headquarters in Hawaii. You know, there was only a few of them that came to the embassy in Bangkok, but since our headquarters was in Hawaii, I think that's where most of the families went to find out information. And they would not give up. You know, they wanted whatever we could find. But the way it was done was, in Hawaii, there's an organization called SILHI, and that's where all the forensics are done. And sometime, I believe in the late 80s or early 90s, they started collecting DNA from family members so that when remains were found, if they were able to get DNA from these remains, they could match up to the family members. And that seemed to have more of an effect on the families accepting, you know, what, I mean, it might have been a handful of bones, but the DNA said that, you know, this belonged to your son or your brother or whatever. But yeah, I felt so bad for those families. It was just terrible to, you know, to see a mom and a dad. You know, we sent our son off to war. I mean, thank God my brother came back. But it was just terrible what these families had gone through for years and years and years. And now, like a lot of the parents have passed away. I mean, they went to their grave not knowing what happened to their son. It was very, very sad. So, like, I didn't mind working 20 hours a day. To me, it was worth it to get answers for these families.
Let us pray to the Supreme Commander that all of our comrades will soon be back within our ranks.
Let us remember and never forget their sacrifices. May God always watch over them and protect them and their loved ones.